Hello, everyone. Welcome to Let's Do Lunch. I hope everyone's doing well and hanging in there. We know there's a lot going on in the world these days. And in fact, before I introduce our panel, today is, of course, the business of games, and we have a super exciting discussion that will follow. I just want to mention that this Friday, we're going to devote the segment at Let's Do Lunch to the topic of race at work and entertainment. And Jonathan Azu, who hosted the session a couple of weeks ago, will be our moderator. He'll have several guests, one from Live Nation Entertainment, and we're going to talk about an open forum with questions encouraged and comments about all the things that are going on in the world today and how we can strive to make our industry better and society in general. So we'll be sending out information about that. But today we have Chris Heatherly back. As you know, Chris is a longtime game industry veteran. He's been with Universal, Disney, and advises a number of top companies in the space. And he has an awesome new background, which we're excited to see, as well as nice lighting, Chris, as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Chris has on the show today Terry Lee. Terry is head of 360 and general manager at Crunchyroll. Crunchyroll is a super cool service. In fact, I think it's the only service that my son, Terry, specifically asked to get the premium membership for. He's a 15-year-old and just loves, the content there. So you're a part of our family here for sure. All right, guys.
Perfect. Good to hear.
Have a good session.
Thanks.
Thanks, Ned. So Terry, before we start off, for the folks who don't know about Crunchyroll, why don't you just tell them a little bit about the company?
Sure, happy to. So Crunchyroll is one of the world's most popular anime brands, and its goal and mission is to connect anime and manga fans across the probably 200 plus countries and territories that we're in. And we service our fans across a variety of 360 experiences, but centrally focused on anime streaming video, then by extension into events, merchandise, commerce, games, etc. And Crunchyroll today is at over 2 million premium subscribers and 60 million users across the world. And we are part of the Warner Media family.
Awesome. And now you are the head of 360. So what does 360 mean?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So 360 for Crunchyroll really means that we want to service our fans beyond video, right? Giving them the full anime experience. So for us, 360 means everything that grows experience outside of video. So including manga, commerce, specific licensing, merchandise, consumer products, both digital and live events, including our own Crunchyroll Expo, and then a host of games that we publish pertaining to the anime genre.
So you take these IPs that are super popular in Asia, particularly Japan, and then you bring them to the West and try to find ways to exploit them, not just in the Crunchyroll service, but outside in consumer products and all these other formats.
That's right. It's really twofold. We try to figure out how to bring the most popular IPs to the West to sort of expose and give our fans more access, but also trying to figure out how to help our Japanese partners expand their kind of brand and IP branding, right? And help figure out ways to really help them realize the full potential of the IP.
Talk, if you would, a little bit, because I know previously you ran, this is your second stint at Crunchyroll. Your first stint was running international. How do you think about, you have these anime shows that are super popular in Japan, and there are a lot of them to choose from. But you're bringing them to new audiences and in different cultures when you bring them to the Western markets. How do you think about what IPs you select? Do some of the anime IPs travel better than others?
Definitely. I think there's a lot of aspects to what makes a good IP, and I think Crunchyroll obviously strives to play a role in identifying and amplifying that. But I think to kind of your original kind of question, I think what we look at is we know that most of the core anime fans do follow the trend lines that happen in Japan, so they have a broad awareness of what's popular there. Now, when it comes to which IPs start performing well with a broader set of audiences, we look at a number of nuanced themes around, whether it's a coming of age, whether it's an action, whether it's talking about relationships, trial by fire, etc. And we have a pretty robust kind of process to identify what we consider really thematically appropriate content that could be really well received by various global audiences. And again, not all audiences are the same, right? If you look at Europe, Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and of course, broadly the US, we have to take into account audience consideration and preferences and cultural nuances. And then so we use all of that to help us identify the right content, to go after the right content, and then where necessary, to sort of like provide background context for that content before we showcase it to our audiences. So there is a lot of work that goes into content programming. We have a pretty large programming team that focuses on selecting content.
Now, when we talk about anime, I think the first thing that pops into a lot of people's minds are, things like Naruto or Dragon Ball Z, or these sort of superhero-esque, big battles, big cartoon battles. But there's a lot of anime that isn't like that at all. There's romance anime, there's detective fiction anime, there's all kinds. There's lots of saying that talking about anime is like talking about animation. Almost you can do almost any type of animation. Are there types of genres that resonate better than others in different markets? Are there interesting things that you've observed, kind of watching user taste and behavior by market?
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. I think with the core audiences, a few key genres do hit home across the board. To the point you made, generally like actiony young adult kind of titles like Naruto, Dragon Ball, Bleach. If you were to extend that into like Dr. Stone, Black Clover, they will hit a lot of different audiences. I think once you move beyond that first initial tier, we certainly have noticed that like in certain Europe, for example, we notice that they do tend to watch a broader set of content that's beyond just pure action. And then in the US, we also notice that we do have audiences that like romance, that like comedy, right? That like adventure more so than just pure action. And ultimately, what we try to do is we try to make sure that we have a recurring pulse on what the audience really wants, region by region. And we try to make sure that we sort of strive the balance between offering the right content for the region, but also having enough parity so that all regions feel like they do have access if they want to towards the same content.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of kind of the way Hollywood and film works. I mean, action, is probably the easiest to translate across languages. It's, requires less reading or less, it's easier to follow if you're not native to the language. And so those action blockbuster films tend to go the broadest. But it reminds me of when I was working with Disney Channel and then later with Telemundo, how popular telenovelas are for them in markets like Spain, where of course it's same language, but even Italy, where it's not the same language, telenovelas were super popular, and it had more to do with just sort of similar cultural tastes. And so I've always found that difference between markets can be pretty interesting. So you're a you started off as a startup. You were part of well, give us a little bit of the history. So you started off as a startup, then you were part of Otter Media and AT&T, and then give us the chronology.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone through a pretty long history. We launched back in 2006, really at the time as more of an anime fan community, where we allowed for a lot of user-generated video sharing and uploads. And really was a way to connect anime fans across the US and broadly English-speaking world outside of Japan. After a couple of years, around 2008, we really shifted our model away from UGC into more of a officially licensed anime site, both as a way to sort of really build the overall service and make sure we have enough good quality, timely content, but also really it was a decision we made around we want to be part of helping to grow the industry and supporting Japan in the anime industry, right? And the only way to really do that well is to help figure out how to help those companies monetize better across the rest of the world. So we did that. And then in 2013, the Chernin Group came in and acquired a majority stake in Crunchyroll and really helped propel us towards much more of a business mindset kind of driven growth. That's around the time we launched commerce. That's around the time we started really amplifying our subscription offering, making sure we had the right value for our fans. And then through that process, the Chernin Group and AT&T have formed a joint venture called Otter Media, which Crunchyroll played a significant component of. And then in 2017, AT&T officially acquired the remainder of Otter Media and bringing basically Crunchyroll into the fold, and specifically under the Warner Media family. So that's how we got to where we are today.
Got it. Got it. And what's it been like to be part of a multi media conglomerate / communications company?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting. A lot of folks at the company didn't really know how to feel when this transition first happened. But I will say, like, it's surprising how much trust and autonomy they actually give. Crunchyroll within Otter, within Warner Media, actually has a lot of trust from leadership to do what we need to do. I think part of that is because we are in a niche vertical, right, where it does require some expertise and specialized knowledge to really function within anime. And I think the Warner Media executive team sort of understands that, like, hey, you guys need the freedom to do what you need to do. I think the second piece that goes along with it is that we have been able to prove our level of success, showcase that we can be a self-sustaining, very very strong and popular service to our fans, and we in that way we know what we're doing, and if we have the right level of support, we can go in that direction. Obviously, there's a little bit of an interesting kind of learning curve for us to like educate the broader company around like this niche vertical that's anime, right? Like when you think about Warner and when you think about the assets they have, it's so broad audience. It's such big tentpole IPs that a lot of times we sort of have to peel back the layers and tell them like, hey, here's this small but growing and very popular and very very high potential vertical that's called anime. That may not be where some of the IPs, Western IPs are today, but it has a lot of potential. So that's been a pretty good learning process.
Now, when you say anime is a niche, there are a lot of ways to interpret that. Do you see anime as a genre that is something that's growing over time, or is it something that has kind of a steady audience that are super dedicated to it, but doesn't really grow in terms of audience reach? How are you thinking about that?
I mean, we definitely view anime as a very high growth with an expanding audience over time, right? I mean, even as we look back when Crunchyroll first started, at the time when we were trying to scope the overall like market potential for anime, our reference points were around like user community forums, YouTube, for example, how many people are watching user created or user uploaded videos. And every couple of years when we do this exercise, trying to understand the size of the global market, we've been pleasantly surprised at how quickly it's grown or outgrown what our previous estimates were. And I think that speaks volumes to just like the popularity and the ability for this IP and all these shows to cross borders and cross languages, right? I think the reason I still call it a niche is primarily twofold. One is because I think it's, to your point earlier, like sometimes a lot of people sort of identify anime as broader animation, right? And there is a big kind of uniqueness to the anime that we consider, which is different from like a Nickelodeon or a pure play Disney, right? A lot of anime have significantly more, I would say, young adult-ish themes. They're not necessarily meant towards like the toddler age or the school age. They also have current issues. A lot of anime titles try to be. There's a broader acceptance of anime, multiple kind of ecosystems where they can all contribute to the industry That's how I consider it niche today.
Interesting, interesting. What do you think is helping drive the growth of anime as a genre? Is it generational? Is it demographic trends? What do you think? What do you think is helping drive that?
Yeah, my belief, and I think a lot of folks who study Crunchyroll, the core belief was always that like anime itself, when we look at like what makes a good anime, they stem from a lot of iterations from like a good storyline through a good manga through good production, right? If you look at some of the top shows, a lot of time and care goes into the scripting, the voice acting, the production quality, the story writing. So everything around it is really high quality, and I think that's what helps it resonate thematically with a lot of people. Really fuels the growth is the ability for people are aware that these shows exist, and we bring them to the global audience. That's what's propelling the growth. We are still finding a lot of new pockets of users who don't know much about anime, have never been exposed to it, but once they do get exposed to it, they fall in love with it.
Yeah, it sounds like curation is a really important part of what you do. I mean, any content service that I've ever been involved in, discovery is always the issue. If you look at the App Store, for example, people always complain about it's hard to get discovered. Netflix, I worked with folks who provided shows to Netflix. They would always complain featuring on the home screen.
Yeah,
So every
yeah.
discovery is always the issue in the content world. How do you think about that curation and what you feature, and just because it just sounds like it's so sort of to what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is by a particular show, their interest is piqued, so they come and watch it. But really, what we want to make sure is after they wait for them to understand how to continue watching, like what are the shows that you should be watching next, right? So we invest a lot of resources into helping to figure out a good programming strategy, a good recommendation algorithm based on the user's watch preferences. Maybe if you watch this show and you're in this demographic group, or it helps us understand what other shows to surface to you. And so we view curation as a much more of um, a personalized experience, and we telling people like, this is the show that everybody's watching. So for some reason, you need to watch it. Give a lot of options. So it is very important. It is a problem that we're constantly working on. And actually, to the point you made earlier, it is something that we want to continuously iteratively improve region to region, because not all regions' audiences follow the same trend lines.
And when you talk about regions, what are your, outside of the United States, sort of what are your other large regions?
Yeah, we have a quite a large presence in Europe. In fact, our European subsidiary is Viz Media Europe, and we recently folded that company into Crunchyroll, and they have a pretty amazing brand and large presence across some of the central countries, Germany, France. We also have a big presence in the UK, Spain. Have a very large brand presence. We go to a lot of events and we have a lot of shows there. And then we also have a huge kind of user base in Latin America, spanning from Mexico down to Brazil, with being the top two countries. But Latin America is a really important region for us because anime has actually been in a lot of those countries, is top of mind. And then we have a pretty large presence in Australia as well, and Canada. And so those are kind of our core territories. We do have users in the Middle East. We have users in Russia. Those are areas where we're actively growing, but those services are relatively new.
When you say you have distribution partners, is your distribution all web and app, or do you do any cable deals or free to air, or are you on any other formats other than digital?
I would say the vast majority of our distribution is O&O, right? So it's web and mobile. Now we do have some partners from time to time that we do license out deals for on television and syndication. We've done a couple in Latin America. We are exploring some in Europe, but I think for the most part, whenever we look at those routes, it's more about helping to educate the audience, grow appeal, and sort of grow the IP. But ultimately, our goal is still to grow our own distribution platforms, and because we are a digital and streaming service at the end of the day.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Now, speaking of distribution, something that I thought was really interesting. Last week, I downloaded HBO Max, like a lot of people, and booted it up, and there was Crunchyroll content, and I didn't know that Crunchyroll was going to be in HBO Max. So, can you talk a little bit about the relationship with HBO Max and the strategy there?
Yeah. So, well, we're part of the same family as HBO Max, and we largely have the same goals, right? We really want to figure out how to take our content and push it out to a broader audience. Now, I think Crunchyroll's relationship with HBO Max is obviously very symbiotic. Like we view our ability to contribute content to HBO Max as a way to help, you know, expose a much broader audience to anime content. And our goal is to actually help HBO Max, reach out to those fans, reach out to those audiences, using some of these key titles. We've specifically, I think we pushed out, 17 titles to HBO Max. It's a small subset of Crunchyroll's actual library of thousands of titles. But the goal there is really, to pique interest of a broader audience, to really showcase a wide variety of key shows that we think add a lot of value to a broad service like HBO Max. I think ultimately the goals of two services, they're going to be targeting different users, right? If you're a hardcore anime fan, you're always going to watch a lot more than 17 shows, so you're going to come to Crunchyroll. But if you're not sure, you're undecided, you want to understand the top shows, but you're not willing to commit to a deep service, well, that's perfect for HBO Max because they have some of these strong titles there.
That's awesome. So let me get to some of the questions. For folks who want to ask questions, just look down at the bottom of the screen. You can press the Q&A button and type questions in there, and I'm monitoring that and asking questions of our friend here. So, will Crunchyroll fund or develop U.S. created anime, even if not animated in the U.S.? What formats will it look like?
Absolutely. I think that is one of our core goals. Going back to what I talked about earlier of wanting to amplify the anime industry, I think a natural kind of conclusion to that is that we got to be more involved in just distribution, right? We should be helping to finance development. We should actually participate in the originals. And so Crunchyroll has the originals division. We have a studio in Burbank, and we have a number of projects that we're exploring that will essentially lead to original development in the form of what we call, Western created anime. And a lot of that today is still us working with Japan partners to find, the right guidance around scripting, story writing. We obviously have a lot of talent in production in the Los Angeles area. And then we're working actively with, a lot of user research groups within our own community to figure out what kind of content would hit home better.
Got it. Makes sense. So another question that I have related to content is, this is actually what I was going to ask you. When you bring productions to the West, do you revoice them, or do you just do subtitles? And if you revoice them, do you revoice them with name talent, or how do you think about talent in general as it applies to voice acting?
Yeah, I mean, I think historically Crunchyroll has focused more on subtitling, and it was more of an active decision at the time because the core base of anime fans when Crunchyroll first started, a lot of the core base really liked that authentic Japanese kind of actual dialogue, and they preferred actually reading the subtitles. So that's where we started off. We focused a lot of our efforts around including subtitling in like 8 different languages, on focusing on that effort. As time passed and we recognized that like, hey, as we get into this broader audience set, we may need to explore more what you're referring to as dubbing, right? And so we have explored dubbing in multiple languages, including I think Spanish, German, French, Portuguese. and to a degree English. I think that is a priority for us, but not necessarily something that we ever see to be the bulk of our content. I think the bulk of our
Mhm.
content will still be subtitles with a small subset to be potentially dubbed. And in terms of like voiceover talent, we haven't really focused that strategy around identifying specific talent or having that need. I think what we looked at initially was how do we find the most authentic sounding voices, right? Because a big part of getting people to really buy in and commit to the anime is they have to really feel like the characters that are being voiced really hit home with the intent. Um, Japan does that really well. They cast really well. So for us, casting the right voice to the right character is going to take more priority than having specific name talent.
Got it. So I want to make sure we talk about games because you do games. So a lot of people don't know that Crunchyroll is in the games business. So why don't you talk about your approach to games?
Sure. So games is a pretty new division for us. Now, part of starting games, we started games a couple years ago, and the original motivation was primarily around how do we bring more experiences to the fans, right? Games is often one of the most asked about kind of content types from our fans because they want to experience more about the anime beyond the show. Once the show's over, what else can they engage with, right? There's merchandising, but there's games too. And so based on that initial kind of feedback, we decided, hey, let's try to help bring some games over from Japan. So when we first started, it was largely a marketing effort, right? We would go to Japan, find partners and say, we have the audience on the anime side. It makes sense for us to try to figure out how to port this game so that they can play it. So we participated in helping to market, helping to do some light publishing. And that was a couple years ago. And over time, we discovered that you know, not all games are readily ported in the same way. And if we're gonna put our name on something, we want to make sure that it's a very high quality and it hits home and it actually fills the need of our fans. And so, over the last couple of years, we really shifted our kind of philosophy around. We do want to do games, but we're going to get into actual game publishing. And so today, where we are today is we're a division that's focused on identifying the right IPs, the right partners, and working with them as a publisher to port the games over, adapt them to the Western audience, and then make them available to the broader Western players.
And when you say port, you're talking about pretty significant changes in the game, right? We talked when we talked yesterday. We were talking about how, particularly in Japan, because people grew up on NTT Docomo as a service, their sense of what a mobile user interface is and how it should work is just completely different from the Western market. Um, how surgical are you getting in making changes in these games?
I mean, that's a great question. I think it's evolving over time. Historically, which is to say that the first couple of iterations we've done this, we weren't that deeply involved in actually changing the core loop of the game, right? We would mostly adapt it via relocalizing the game into English, changing the dialogue, potentially looking at whether the content was appropriate, and making some suggestions around monetization process. Over time, including some of the projects we're working on now, we are actually handling the entire port from scratch. So we're taking potentially just the IP or a very base layer of the source code and adding on top of that various mechanics, various monetization updates, and really making sure that the loop itself, the core loop itself, jives with the Western play style. I think what we had talked about before, and when I mentioned to a lot of the partners is, one of the common examples is a lot of Japan games and Chinese games by extension. They're very pay to win, pay to win heavy, right? And you basically stay competitive. You have to fork over a lot of money. And while there are certainly games like that in the West, like predominantly, that's not necessarily seen as a very strong positive, right? So we want to make sure that if we are looking at a game that has the potential to do that, we want to offer enough ways to adjust that core loop mechanic so that players can play the game without having to fork over 4 or 5 figures on a monthly basis.
So you're looking for games that are based on anime IP, or not from Japan and other markets that have been successful, and then looking for ways to bring them to the into the West. Is that sort of fair to say your initial focus?
Yeah, certainly. I think we start at the audience layer, right? And so we basically look at of our audience, what games are they going to like to play, and what games are we good at pushing to them, right? Like, there's a huge overlap between anime and game audiences. Now, you can make the argument that, like, maybe they like to play a first-person shooter, but then we'll evaluate. That's not really where our bread and butter is. We're not going to go and bring them a AAA shooter. So we look at what games make sense for our audience. And predominantly that's going to be based off of Japanese IP, but there are a lot of games that are not based on a specific anime IP. They're more like an anime look type of game, what we call, like, the art styles are very reminiscent, the characters are reminiscent, but they may not be based off of a specific show or manga. And we work towards that a lot. And we are even exploring some original games following those themes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, will you do originals? And if so, what would you look for an original to do for you?
Yeah, I think we are exploring that. I think we are slow rolling that a bit just because um, we're still really working out and working through developing our publishing capabilities. We're a pretty new publisher. We want to make sure we get the formula right, um, and not inundate our fans with too many like original titles until we have a good formulaic approach. But right now, we do have a couple of original titles in active development that we're looking at. And really, at the end of the day, we look at narrative, art style, and whether it resonates with our fans. And if it does, then we invest into those areas.
Now, you've talked a lot about the audience, your fans, and engagement with them. What are the ways that you engage with your audience? What channels, and how, just talk about how you engage with them.
Yeah, I mean, Crunchyroll has a pretty large audience development team that puts out a lot of content through social media. They do a lot of recurring casts, streams, and are pretty active in conversing with our fans to sort of understand what they like, what they don't like, where the overall anime trend is going. On top of that, we also have a pretty large kind of live and digital presence. We attend, I think, 50 plus conventions globally in a variety of different countries, languages, where we basically go and sponsor those events, or we have a booth and engage with our fans. And that's a primary way where we have a live dialogue with them. On top of that, we also have two really big owned and operated events. One is called the Anime Awards, where we basically, it's like the Oscars for anime, right?
Mm.
Where we pull together all anime titles, whether or not it's on our service. And it's meant to be more of an industry view of, like, we allow votes. And we've held it for a few years already, and it's been wildly successful. Millions upon millions of votes are cast to see what are the top shows that year, and we create this feeling of like and ultimately an awards experience. And then the other big show we have is Crunchyroll Expo, which is basically our own and operated convention, where we not only showcase like the broader anime kind of titles, but we really try to give our fans an inside look around how the anime industry and how Crunchyroll itself works. Right, we host a lot of panels from everything from like art style to voice acting to the localization process to games to various interviews.
Now, of course, in the time of COVID, in-person conferences are harder to do. We don't know how long we're going to be in this state of all, working from home, or when we'll be able to do large gatherings again. Are you thinking about taking your Crunchyroll Expo virtual? Any thinking there?
That is an active discussion we've been having internally. Uh, you know, Primarily because it is, we do have a lot of updates, and we do have a lot of like things that we want to share with our fans, right? And given the fact that we don't know when COVID will end at this point, right? Given the landscape, we think it makes sense to actively explore ways to virtually connect. Um, specifically in what form that takes and exactly how that will look, we're still working that out. But it is very top of mind for the events team that's part of 360 as well.
Got it. And getting back to your games business, how many titles are you looking to manage or launch a year or at one time? What platforms?
Yeah, historically, I mean, to date, we've been a little bit more ad hoc. We've been taking opportunities as they come. But I think
Mhm.
moving forward, we want to be a little bit more structured. We're looking at, anywhere between 4 to 6 titles a year. Um, and a part of that is to make sure that we have um, the right volume so that it's enough variety for the fans, because it's not like all of our 60 million registered users will play the same game, right? So we want to have enough variety to service all the fans, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we don't go overboard on the volume so that we can't commit the right level of support resources and ongoing kind of community engagement per game, right? As you well know, like um, a big part of games these days is really the post-launch community engagement, the live operations, right? And I think that's what's really giving us kind of like this guided between 4 to 6 in ideal state. I think we're still working towards that. But in terms of platform, we're primarily focused on mobile, but we have explored um, publishing browser or PC games. It just sort of depends on, like, we our original charter was to try to bring the experience to as many fans as possible, and mobile made that easier because everybody has a mobile phone, and most games, all the games we've done today are free to play. Once we get into like where you have to pay to purchase the game, then we start thinking about, like, is this the right motivation for us as opposed to servicing our fans?
Well, and mobile is by far and away the largest platform in the Asian markets as well.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I mean,
And that's where a lot of games from Japan are initially based off of too.
yeah, totally. Um, so in terms of services or skill sets that you have on your side, uh, publishing can mean different things to different companies. What does publishing mean for Crunchyroll? What kind of skill sets and services do you offer your developers?
Yeah, I mean, great question. I think it's going to be a range, but first and foremost, our publishing strategy stems and starts with an on-platform kind of set, because we already have such a broad audience that come to all of the O&O properties for Crunchyroll. Our primary service is we market and promote the game through a variety of on-site channels, including web, mobile, lifecycle, social media. Um, and then depending on the developer, depending on the IP, we do provide additional layers of performance marketing and paid media that wraps around it. Um, we sometimes layer in live operations, but generally speaking, that piece will be handled by a partner of ours. We don't have an in-house like large development team that handles that per se. Um, and then as part of the publishing process, we typically also help handle the localization. We also, simply because we have a lot of experience localizing Japanese to all these Western languages, and we have a pretty amazing content operations team. So a lot of times we help manage that process to make sure that the game itself is ported correctly.
Got it. Got it. So if you look, let's say 10 years out, um, as you get your game, let's say you're going gangbusters and your gaming initiative is super successful, which I hope it will be.
Thanks.
What do you think Crunchyroll Games looks like?
I mean, that's a great question. I think in success, we want Crunchyroll Games to be um, as big of a pillar of an audience driver and a revenue driver to Crunchyroll as the video side is, right? I think specifically we view games of success as two key kind of value adds. One is, of course, naturally that games itself is a huge um, monetization industry. So there's plenty of billion-dollar franchises. Um, but second is that we recognize that games will allow Crunchyroll holistically to tap into a broader audience, right? Like invariably, I don't think anyone would dispute that the games audience is actually much bigger than a pure anime audience.
Mhm.
And as we try to grow our presence and brand in anime, we necessarily have to um, help tap and educate adjacent audiences. And games is a huge adjacent audience where if we can bring them into the ecosystem through a game and through that educate them on anime and get them excited about a show or anime and become a fan of the brand, then that's what we view as a big long-term success.
That sort of leads into a question that I have from Ann Toole here, which is around how much do you see these games as being for the core uh, Crunchyroll anime fans, and how much do you see them as a vehicle to introduce new audiences to these characters, and connected to that, how much do you see this as extending the storyline and being storyline driven, or really being gameplay driven?
Yes, right. That is also a great question. I think so. I'm going to provide my more personal opinion here. Uh, I think that a good game, a good anime game, at least in today's landscape, should be geared more towards exposing the IP to a broader set of fans with good game mechanics, right?
Mm.
Like I don't think that you certainly can have a game that is just meant for core fans. So you're putting a lot of fan servicey elements, right? Like around the character narrative, around the story, but you don't really polish the game. And that can still get you a lot of players in a short time and make you some money, but it doesn't really have longevity. And it's not a game that resonates well outside of core anime fandom. And so we've seen firsthand, a number of titles in Japan that the game itself is, for lack of better words, not super well polished, right?
Mm.
But they get a lot of users in for a very short period of time because they just love the IP. They spend money on the IP, and the game company intends to do that, and then just move on, right? And those for us never make as much sense because we're not really like Crunchyroll Games itself isn't really in the business of like rapid fire games, maximize short-term profit and just move on. Like that doesn't really contribute to the ecosystem and doesn't really jive with our mission. So when we look for games, it's much more around like, does this have the potential to go beyond the core audience, and is it more focused on product quality and less specific narrative?
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I mean, as you're talking, I'm thinking about what Niantic did with Pokemon Go, and obviously that's a once in a generation phenomenon with with an IP that is a once in a half a
Yeah,
century phenomenon, but nevertheless, I mean, they took a super successful anime IP, although most people don't think of it, well, trading card and anime and manga IP. Most people don't even think of it as a Eastern IP anymore. And in fact, it's the biggest franchise in the world,
yeah,
and most people don't know that. But with Pokemon Go, other than the super novel, incredibly novel aspect of the location-based gaming, it also was a super easy game to play that was very
totally.
accessible to a wide variety of characters, or a wide variety of players. And so you had kids and their parents who maybe would not have appreciated the deep RPG mechanics of the traditional Pokemon, who just wanted to collect those characters. um
Yeah.
how casual do you think you can get with an anime IP like that?
I think it can go pretty casual. I think Pokemon Go was a great example of a game where they took a lot of care around the core mechanics, right? They make the mechanics itself fun, and it was a good balance where if you were an anime fan of Pokemon, like it was very meaningful what you caught, and you knew what the Pokemons you were catching, how rare they were. If you were an anime fan, the mechanics itself still made the game fun, and you didn't necessarily need to get too deep. Um, but in terms of like general kind of casualness, it's a little bit hard to say because if you only look at the games that are coming out of Japan, Japan as a industry for mobile games, especially pertaining to anime, um, it's to their advantage to build pretty deep RPG games, right? Because they have such a large core fan base of that IP inside of Japan that it's just easier to take the same formula of RPG, modify it to a specific IP, and roll it out, and you'll have a ton of people playing. But I think as you try to expand that game globally, you necessarily have to make the game a more quote unquote casual, right? At least easier to pick up. You have to start looking at genres that maybe that the traditional developers don't prioritize, such as match 3 games, such as runner games. These lifestyle games. These games have a broader appeal. They're not as widely used in Japan, but I think that is where we often try to think about how we take our originals. Like if we were to do an original game, as we're looking at, it's going to be air slightly on the more casual side, right? And we're not going to go try to make and replicate another hardcore RPG game that Japan does so much of already.
Got it. So I have another question here that's come in. When you look at some of the Western IPs like Harry Potter or Marvel, Star Wars. I mean, I was involved in a lot of my career was helping build these traditional entertainment IPs into franchises. Are there lessons that you take from that model that you want to apply to anime?
You're talking about in terms of influencing the IP, or in terms of
reaching broader audiences through other media in general, but also consumer products, and can we see a Crunchyroll IP become a everyday household phenomenon with with a really broad audience like Pokemon has become?
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing will beat the relative importance of the quality of content, the characters, the storylines, and the themes, right? So you want to make sure whatever we're producing or we're acquiring has the potential to resonate with as broad of an audience as possible, right? And so, as an example, there are a lot of really popular shows in Japan that resonate really well in Asia, but they have a very kind of Asia-centric tone, or like the nuances, the cultural nuances is hard for a Westerner of whatever background to really understand and align with. So we want to make sure we identify the right IPs and the right shows. In terms of execution, I do think that's the goal of my division, right? Is we recognize that, like, if you just have an anime show and you're like, I expect this to be a globally recognized brand, that's probably unlikely unless you start doing all the other aspects that help boost the recognition of an IP. Including games, including merchandising, including